Hello everyone, my name is Anna and welcome back to this new video on this channel, Jóvenes Pregonando. In today's video, we are going to be studying chapters 44 and 45 of Genesis. And today's video is titled Yossef and his brothers testing fidelity to receive the blessing, part 2. And starting off with verses 1 through 5 of Chapter 44, it says, Now Joseph gave these instructions to the steward of his household. Fill the men's sacks with as much as food as they can carry, and put each man's silver in the mouth of their sack. Then put my cup, the golden one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, along with the silver of his grain. And he did as Joseph said. As morning dawned, the men were sent on their way with their donkeys. They had not gone far from the city when Joseph said to his steward, Go after those men at once, and when you catch up with them, say to them, Why have you repaid good with evil? Isn't this the cup my master drinks from and also uses it for guessing? This is a wicked thing you have done. And the first thing that we can see in these verses is the word guess or guessing. And this refers to the interpretations that Joseph made and for which he was really well known in the land of Egypt. Now, it is not that Joseph was a literal fortune teller, since we have seen and we have read that Joseph said that it was the Eternal who revealed the dreams to him and that he did not do it himself. Another thing we can see being mentioned in these verses is when it says with the golden cup with the golden cup is the one he guesses with. And this may sound as if Joseph himself was a real Egyptian with pagan practices, but that was not it. The reason why his steward said that was because, was so his brothers wouldn't discover his true identity. From verses 6 through 16, we are able to read and to see how Joseph once again gives his brothers one more test. He tests them again, and this was to continue observing how they behaved. Perhaps for his brothers, this type of situations could be very stressful for them because, we can read that all they wanted to do was to return to their land with their father and their families. But the Egyptian, Joseph, apparently did not want to let them go, and the last thing that they wanted to happen happened, and this was with Benjamin. Benjamin was the one who was in Joseph's hands. And knowing what Benjamin meant to Jacob, his brothers were not going to leave him alone as they did with Joseph. We can see here that their brothers negotiate with Joseph. So in order for Benjamin to go back to his father, because they knew the importance that Benjamin meant for Jacob. And they were not going to leave him behind, just like they did with Joseph, that his own brothers sold him to the Ishmaelites so they could get rid of him. And we can see that in these verses 6 through 16, we can read that Joseph's brothers, tore their clothes and went back to Joseph's house. And this time it was Judah who stands up for Benjamin, and Judah begins to declare his guilt of everyone. and he faces, and he stands up for, he puts himself in front of everyone. And well, this guilt was based on what they had done to Joseph. Sometime we can see when they sold him, and he understood. Judah understood that the Eternal had declared them guilty. So they all offered themselves together with Benjamin, or all the brothers offered themselves as slaves for Joseph, in order for Benjamin to go back to his father's house. And the words of Judah prophetically represent the same tribe of Judah, those who were called leaders of Israel, when they realized their sin, when they delivered the Messiah, when they delivered him, when they killed him, they knew that there was no justification for what they have done with the Messiah, and they knew that they were guilty. And this same guilty was the guilty that Joseph's brothers felt. And yeah, verse 17 says, "But Joseph said, Far be it from me to do such a thing. Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you go back to your father in peace." And well, here we can see that Joseph tells his brothers that they could go back to their land, but that the guilty one had to stay. And as we know, well, the guilty one was Benjamin. And well, Benjamin represented hope for Jacob, the one who was going to acquire the blessing and the promise that the Eternal had given to Abraham. And so his brothers obviously knew this, and this is why we see that his brothers do everything they can in order for Benjamin to go back to his father. We can see that they are not going to leave him behind like they did with Joseph. And verse 18 says, "Then Judah went up to him and said, Pardon your servant, my lord. Let me speak a word to my lord. Do not be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself." And well, the offspring of Judah within the people of Israel was the head. The descendants of Judah were the head of the people of Israel. That is to say, the main one, the one that received the leadership of all the tribes. And here we can see the participation of Judah. We can see that he puts himself first. And well, it is curious. A curious thing that we can see here is how Reuben is not the one who stands up for Benjamin, or the one who stands up for all his brothers, since Reuben was the firstborn, and here he was the big brother. And here we can see that wonderful shadow, Judah, who approaches Joseph, who is the shadow of the Messiah. So here we can see that the eldest brother does not stand up for the rest of his brothers, but Judah is the one who stands up. And well, in the time of Yeshua, the Jews having the principality were the ones who came to find out what was happening with the Messiah. And in the scriptures, we can see a situation similar to this. This situation was with Nicodemus, and we can find this in John 3, verses 1 through 15. Well, it is related to how Nicodemus, being a Torah teacher, approaches Yeshua at night to find out where Yeshua came from, and how is it that he had the authority that he had, or that he had. And Nicodemus, we can see that he does not approach like the rest of the religious leaders did with the Messiah to argue with him. But we can see and we can read that Nicodemus approached him to understand the mystery of Yeshua. He was interested in what he was and why he did what he was doing. And so yeah. And so we see this kind of approach. We can also see this kind of approach here with Judah. And we can see that Judah asks for mercy and recognizes that Joseph had the authority as Pharaoh. Like Joseph, the Messiah represents the eternal, and in this we can see one more prophecy and the prophetic shadow in Joseph. Verses 19 through 20, it says, "My Lord asked his servants, 'Do you have a father or a brother?' And we answered," this is Judah speaking, "and we answered, 'We have an aged father, and there is a young son born to him in his old age. His brother is dead, and he is the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him.' Then you said to your servants, 'Bring him down to me so I can see him for myself.' And we said to my Lord, 'The boy cannot leave his father. If he leaves him, his father will die.'" And while in verse 21, we see that it is said that, "Bring him down to me so I can see him for myself." In some versions, it says, "Bring him to me and I will put my eyes on him." We can see here that Joseph asks for Benjamin because he wanted to see if they were really telling the truth, or if it was all a lie about his brother Benjamin still being alive, and his father. And what Judah wanted to say, what was the purpose for which Joseph wanted to see Benjamin. And while Joseph wanted to see Benjamin, he wanted to see him because he was his younger brother. And although his brothers didn't know that, since, as we know, they didn't know because they didn't recognize Joseph as their brother, and but Joseph wanted to see his younger brother. And Benjamin represents Jacob's beloved son after Joseph was no longer with him, since we know that Joseph was Jacob's beloved son, and then him being sold off, then Benjamin became his beloved son, and he was the only one he had. So there was nothing left but Benjamin. And Jacob loved Joseph and Benjamin very much because they were sons of his wife, the most beloved, who was Rachel. And Benjamin is a subtitle, but also in him represents the promise of faith. While Benjamin was alive, the promise was also alive. But if Jacob lost Benjamin, then he would also lose a promise. This promise was the promise that the Eternal had given Abraham, and that continued with the patriarchs. Okay, so if meanwhile Benjamin, as long as Benjamin was alive, so was the promise alive. And we can see that Joseph is very interested in this because he wanted to see this part of his brother's life, of his brother's lives. And Jacob shows and figures that the Messiah came obviously to make Israel have the little light that Judah had at that moment in front of Joseph. because this is what it says in the scriptures. We find that it says that for love of David, the Eternal was going to leave a little light that would illuminate all of Israel and would never go out and would remain. So that was the hope. This is the hope. And when Judah is recounting everything that happened, when he's telling everything that Joseph has said and everything that they had done, he has an objective, and we will see how he continues in the following verses. The basis of the patriarchs was basically based on their descendant, and in verses 22 through 29, we can see how Jacob has that look of passing the blessing on to Rachel's children, and it could probably be seen as if Jacob ignored his other children, but that was not it. Something that is something very curious is that during the history of the people of Israel, it was not always the children of Joseph and Benjamin who kept this promise. But for Jacob, at that moment, it seemed that this was his hope, that they would keep the faith and not be contaminated. And well, we can see that Jacob had a very strong pain in his soul for the loss of his beloved son, Joseph. And the only thing that Jacob had, that Jacob tried, was not to feel the same for the loss of his son Benjamin. He wanted to prevent the same loss that he had with Joseph. So this is why his older brothers took care of Benjamin, because they knew the importance that Benjamin meant to Jacob. In the last verses of this chapter 44, we see how Judah tries to negotiate with Joseph, and we see that Judah says that Benjamin's soul is linked to Jacob's. This shows us how the faith of the patriarchs is closely linked with the promise that the Eternal had given them. But in chapter 45, we will see that Joseph can no longer handle his emotions, and because of this, it is why that he reveals himself to his brothers. And let's read verses 1 through 5 of chapter 45. 1 through 2 of chapters 45, that says, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it." Through these verses, we have seen that Joseph was surrounded during this whole conversation that he had with his brothers. We can see that he was surrounded by Egyptians, and this was so they could interpret. Interpret his to him what his brothers told him and what Joseph would tell his brothers. We see that Joseph, could no longer contain himself, and we read that he orders everyone to leave that place except for his brothers. So here we see that Joseph is, because of the emotions he felt, he didn't want no one to be there, and he was prepared to reveal himself to his brothers, and that is why he tells everyone to leave except for his brothers. And in the following verses, we will see what Joseph tells his brothers. From verses 3 to 5, it says, "Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still living?' But his brothers were not able to answer him, because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come closer to me.' When they had done so, he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt.' And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that Elohim sent me ahead of you. And well, here we can see how Joseph teaches, or here Joseph teaches us that first we have to cut off the contributions of men and leave only the purity of faith in order to understand what was truly happening in history. We see how Joseph introduces himself to his brothers and tells them, "I am Joseph." And the idea, this word, or how it is said in Hebrew, is Ani Yossef. And well, his brothers, we can see that were very surprised, because surely, we can see here that Joseph did not use a translator as he would normally do when talking to his brothers. And this was because he was speaking to them in the language that they spoke. And well, we can see that all these types of tests that Jacob was giving his brothers were not so that his brothers would get annoyed or stressed or any kind of these emotions, but it was to test them, and if they have changed, if they have changed, or if they were still the same brothers or the same people that Joseph knew. And well, when he tells them that he is Joseph, he asks them about his father. And obviously he knew that he was alive because they had already mentioned him several times. But what he really wanted to know was if Jacob's hope was still alive. That hope in which he was educated and that until we can see that until his death, Joseph remained in that hope as well. That hope that was in Jacob was also in Joseph. And well, these are shadows that Joseph surprisingly fulfills of the Messiah, who was sent from heaven to his brothers to see if in humanity men still in some lived the hope of salvation that the Eternal will send them. Something that we can also see within all these events is how Joseph was a nobleman with many virtues, because he did not pay his brothers with the evil that they did to him, but we can see that he gave them good. And this is also a characteristic that we find in the Heavenly Father, who considers the souls in their favor, or in their favor when they do teshuvah, which, as we know, means returning to the Father. And well, as we can read in Numbers 14:18, that says, the Eternal is slow to anger, abounding in love and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Just as Joseph tested his brothers to see if they had changed, so the Eternal, we can see that the Eternal forgives the souls that bear fruits worthy of repentance. And well, he does not consider all the evil that the souls have done in reality, when in reality they wanted to get closer to the Eternal. And we'll continue with verses 6 through 7. It says, "For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But Elohim sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. This helps us understand why when Yeshua came, it was certainly a time of hunger, but when Yeshua left, it was also going to be seen hunger. When it says in verse 6, the word 5, it is the definition of grace, mercy, and goodness. So when Yeshua is sent to preserve in life, we can see that he first takes care of his house, and then for the people, he takes care of the people of the nation. And we'll later on in these verses, we will be able to see how Joseph firstly takes care of his house and then of the Egyptians. And when Yeshua comes back in his second coming, he will end all evil. And Paul says that the only enemy that is missing is death. But he says in the letter to the Hebrews that when Yeshua came for the first time, it was because of sin. That is, he came to give life. But the second coming will be in relation to judgment. And in verses 8 through 11, we read that, or we see that Joseph tells his brothers to remove that weight, or to remove the weight from to remove that fear that they had for having sold him. And this was because the Eternal, for good, was the one who had taken him there. All this Eternal allowed it to happen for a purpose. And we can see that it was the Eternal who made him a father for Pharaoh, and father in Hebrew is Ab. And it is not that Joseph was superior to Pharaoh, or that he was Pharaoh himself, but this concept of father meant that Joseph had the position of representing Pharaoh, of bearing the name, and that after Pharaoh, Joseph had to be obeyed by all Egyptians. The Heavenly Father gave the Messiah this title of Ab, and in Isaiah 9:6, we see how Yeshua is called Eternal Father. In the religions, due to their ignorance of the Hebrew concept, they say that by this verse is why Yeshua is the Father, or as it is known, Jesus is God. But in these verses of Joseph's, as we know, this is not true. And in these verses of Joseph's life, Joseph's lives is that we can realize that in reality, what we see of the Messiah in Isaiah is that the Messiah is the Father of all, and the governor whom the Eternal has sent to this earth. On the other hand, what we can find in these verses is how Joseph sends for his father and promises him the land of Goshen, a very good and prosperous land that was north of Egypt in the Mediterranean Sea and was distant from all places, and all the highlands of Egypt, from all the it was far away from the places that had or that was full of idolatry. It was a land that was a part of that. And that good land, this good land that Joseph, or is where Joseph was going to support his father and his brothers. We can read that Joseph was going to take care of his father and his brothers, and of course the families that came, or that were their families. And Goshen in Hebrew is Goshna, and this word, according to the Jewish translation, its numerical gematria, its numerical gematria, is the same as that of Mashiach. That is to say that this earth also has a prophetic shadow with Yeshua. Oh no, this earth, no, this land that Joseph gave to his father and his brothers had also had a prophetic shadow with Yeshua, who brought the kingdom to the kingdom of heaven to humanity, or so that through the Messiah, humanity would once again have the opportunity to be reconciled with the Father. So Yeshua represents the fertile and abundant land where there is sustenance for souls. In verses 12 through 23, we read that Joseph had love, compassion, humanity, a nice soul, and a soul that was approved by the Eternal. For Jacob and his children, Joseph was the rescuer who took them out of the heavy famine that they were going through. And once again, Joseph was a shadow of the Messiah who completed the redemption in us, giving us abundance. Joseph gave them abundance on earth for their sustenance, but the Messiah brought something better to humanity, which is life in abundance. In John 10:10, it says, "The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come so that they may have life, and have it abundantly." In verse 24 of this chapter 45, it says, "Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, 'Don't quarrel on the way,' or don't fight on the way." And here we see that Joseph knew his brothers, and he knew that they were still disturbed in their heart, or they were still disturbed in their hearts for having seen him and knowing that Joseph was still alive, and that perhaps along the way they were going to argue, or they were going to blame each other for having sold him, or perhaps full of fear along the way, they could have doubted what he was going to do with them once they brought his father to him. And we can see that because of this reason, it is why Joseph tells his brothers that on their way back to getting their dad, they shouldn't argue, to go get his father and to bring him to his place, to Joseph's place. The Messiah also fulfills this prophetic shadow when he prays for his disciples on the Mount of Olives, where he asks the Eternal that they'd be one, just as Yeshua, as the Messiah, and the Father were one. That is to say that they had echad in Hebrew, that those who believed in his name had only one thought, one commandment, only one teaching, and only one hope. Lastly, in these last verses, we can see that when Jacob's sons arrive with him to give him the good news that his son Joseph was still alive, it had already been 22 years since Joseph left his father's house. And during those 22 years, what we see in the scriptures is that Jacob was a man who was sad. Perhaps he had resigned himself and leaned on Benjamin, but there was also sadness in his soul because of Joseph, since he had many virtues or he had seen many virtues in Joseph, he knew that something good was going to be in Joseph's life. In all this time, it seems that Jacob did not consult the Eternal about what had happened with Joseph, nor had the Eternal revealed to him if his son Joseph was dead or not. But Jacob had in his mind that his son was dead. He already had that in his mind. He was sure of it. But when his children came and told him how they had seen Joseph, we can see that he didn't doubt what they told him. He listened to them and believed them and was willing to go to meet his beloved son Joseph. When Jacob knows that Joseph was alive, he comes back to life. His spirit lives again, since in all the verses that we have read, we can see that Jacob was mentioned as Jacob. And in the last verse, we can read that he is mentioned as Israel. Because once again, he has overcome adversity and waited alive until the day he saw his son Joseph again. So lastly, we see this, we can see that Joseph and his father were reunited after 22 years. And well, thank you very much for watching this video. This is it for this video. And if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can leave them down in the comment section down below. Thank you very much once again, and have a good day.